It was in the spring of 1923 that the still air of Cairo was stirred by a single whispered tale. The noble Earl of Carnarvon, the patron of Egypt's greatest discovery, had died suddenly in his hotel room, his body overcome by fever and infection, his soul carried from the desert sands into eternity. Across Europe, across the polished halls of London and the dimly lit drawing rooms of the countryside, voices lowered to speak of curses and secrets, as if a forgotten pharaoh had claimed vengeance upon the one who had dared to disturb his rest. Yet in the shadow of this moment, half seen by the world's press and scarcely spoken of among the aristocracy, stood the woman whose life was bound to his, the Countess, Lady Almina Carnarvon. She had brought him his fortune, had carried him through years of waste and indulgence, and now stood alone, draped not in reverence, but in whispers. Welcome, dear listener, to this quiet telling. Share with us when and where you are listening, for you are part of a memory stretched across oceans and continents. Let your presence be known in the stream of voices that binds this circle together. And if you find meaning in this story, I invite you to subscribe, so this weaving of lives may continue for us all. There are lives that begin in light, surrounded by banners and bells, and there are others that slip into the world through the veils of silence. Almina Victoria Marie Alexandra Wombwell was born in 1876, but her true beginning lies not in the parish records or the hushed christening ceremonies, but in the whispered scandal that followed her into every chamber she ever entered. For she was the daughter not of her mother's lawful husband, Frederick Charles Wombwell, but of Alfred de Rothschild, the wealthy and eccentric scion of a banking dynasty that had stitched much of Europe's financial life into its net. The Rothschild name carried with it immeasurable weight, but also secrecy, for Alfred himself remained unmarried, and his generosity often expressed itself in hidden ways, in homes and in children never fully acknowledged. Almina was the living testament to one such hidden legacy. In her childhood, wealth was her constant companion, and yet it was a wealth that never freed her from questions. She was raised by her mother, Marie Boyer, a Frenchwoman whose beauty had been admired in certain circles, but who never attained the status of her patron's lawful consort. Through Alfred's influence, Almina was given the trappings of privilege, fine clothes, education, the company of servants, but behind the silks and polished surfaces lay an unspoken truth. She was not of pure lineage in the eyes of aristocratic England. Every door she entered opened with both welcome and hesitation. It is said that Alfred adored his daughter in his peculiar way. He could not make her legitimate in the eyes of society, yet he showered her with the means to shine among them. A father's love, expressed in jewels and gowns, was a strange balm for the child who grew to notice the averted glances at dinners, the laughter too quickly silenced when she approached. What is wealth, one wonders, when it cannot silence a whisper? Her earliest years unfolded in a curious balance of indulgence and scrutiny. She grew accustomed to the gleam of chandeliers, the scent of imported perfumes, and the cold marble floors of grand houses. But at times she must have listened to the rain outside and wondered why belonging was always conditional. For a child, such awareness arrives not in words, but in feelings, the half-formed ache of knowing one is different. Almina's education was one of refinement, but not of depth. In the late Victorian age, daughters were prepared less for knowledge and more for presentation, and in this she excelled. She was petite, lively, with dark eyes that seemed to catch the light in unexpected ways. She learned to dance gracefully, to smile when required, and to deflect questions with charm. Yet beneath the surface, the rootlessness of her identity grew silently. By the time she reached womanhood, her father's wealth had become her greatest dowry, and her ambiguous birth her greatest liability. The English aristocracy, forever hungry for money to sustain their great houses, had little difficulty overlooking whispers if the price was right. Thus the young Almina, scarcely 20, was placed upon a stage where her future would be decided not by affection, but by transaction. Imagine, if you will, the drawing rooms of Mayfair in the 1890s, the air thick with smoke from cigars, the shuffle of cards upon green felt, the murmur of men calculating not only their wagers, but also the futures of their families. It was in such circles that the match was proposed between Almina and George Edward Stanhope Molyneux Herbert, the 5th Earl of Carnarvon. He was a man of pedigree but little coin, heir to Highclere Castle, a grand seat of nobility crumbling under debts as vast as its rooms. She was the daughter of wealth, cloaked in scandal. Together they formed a union that satisfied both hunger and pride. He would secure his estate, and she would secure her place among the titled. And so, her childhood of uncertainty led her toward a destiny of grandeur, but grandeur purchased at the cost of self. Did she know, on the day of her betrothal, that she was stepping into a cage, gilded though it might be? Did she, beneath her youthful smile, carry the awareness that her life's worth had been measured not in affection, but in figures upon a ledger? History cannot say, yet the image remains. A young woman, radiant in her finery, walking into Highclere Castle for the first time, her footsteps echoing against stone that had stood for centuries, stone that had waited for her wealth to keep it alive. The shadows of her birth would never leave her, but within them she carried a vitality, a determination to shape her place in a world that had tried to set her apart. Wealth gave her entry, but only her will could give her permanence. Still, the whispers lingered, like a draft beneath a locked door, always reminding her that the house she entered had opened not out of love, but out of need. And as her carriage rolled through the gates of Highclere, the wind stirred the trees, carrying with it the sound of distant crows, as if echoing a warning she could not yet hear. The sound of the crows circling over the estate faded into the heavy silence of Highclere's ancient halls. The great doors closed behind Almina, and with them closed the chapter of her youth. Before her stretched corridors lined with portraits of Herberts long gone, men and women whose features were stern, whose gazes seemed fixed on the young bride with a mixture of curiosity and judgment. She entered not merely a house, but a lineage, a world that measured its worth not in the warmth of affection, but in the endurance of legacy. Highclere Castle was both fortress and stage, a place where appearances could never falter, for stone itself seemed to carry memory, whispering that every step must serve the name. Her marriage to George Herbert, the 5th Earl of Carnarvon, was spoken of in the polite language of society pages as a splendid match, a union of beauty and wealth. Yet beneath the gilded words lay the truth known to all who cared to see. The Earl had gambled away much of his fortune, and without Almina's dowry the estate would crumble into decay. It was Alfred de Rothschild, her father in all but name, who secured the match with his lavish promise. £1 million would pass into Highclere's coffers, enough to restore its grandeur, enough to wipe away the debts that gnawed at its foundations. The Earl, though titled and pedigreed, could not resist such salvation. The Countess, though whispered about and half acknowledged, could not refuse such a throne. Their wedding in 1895 was a spectacle of diamonds and expectation. The bride, small of stature but glowing with youth, carried with her the secret weight of illegitimacy, though the pearls around her neck seemed to disguise it well. Guests murmured in admiration at the union, but one wonders whether their eyes lingered more on the jewels than on the faces. Did the Earl see in his bride a partner, or merely the golden key to unlock his survival? Did Almina, behind her practiced smile, feel the tremor of a heart uncertain of its place? The days that followed swept her into the rhythm of aristocratic life. There were dinners beneath glittering chandeliers, hunts across rolling fields, and weekends of endless conversation measured more in gossip than in truth. Highclere became her domain, yet it was a domain weighted with expectation. She was to be hostess, guardian, and ornament. Her presence meant to restore not only the finances of the estate, but its social prestige. In her, the Earl had found not a companion of affection, but a vessel of redemption. She bore this role with a grace that seemed effortless, though perhaps only because she had long since learned to mask discomfort with charm. And yet, for all its grandeur, Highclere could feel strangely empty. The castle's countless rooms were often silent, their vastness creating an echo of loneliness. Servants moved like shadows, present yet unseen, their discreet bows and curtsies reminding her always that she was mistress here, but mistress because her wealth allowed it. The Earl spent much of his time away, in clubs, at the races, in pursuits that consumed more coin than affection. Almina remained, tending to the house, entertaining guests, and learning to fill the silence with her own presence. It is said that she took delight in arranging the great dinners, in adorning the halls with flowers, in ensuring that every guest felt attended to. In these small acts, she may have found her first sense of belonging, a way of claiming Highclere as not merely a place she had entered, but a place she had shaped. For who among us does not try to carve meaning into the spaces where we are planted, even when the soil is reluctant to accept us? Her father, Alfred de Rothschild, often visited, his carriage rolling through the gates with a retinue that spoke of his vast resources. To some, his presence was a reminder of her questionable birth. To Almina, it was the comfort of loyalty. He loved her in his peculiar, restrained way, and through his fortune he had given her what society would not, a seat among the titled. Yet love, when measured in coin, carries its own ambiguity. Was she the daughter cherished or the child compensated? These are questions only silence can answer, and silence, as always, was abundant within Highclere's walls. The Earl, meanwhile, grew increasingly restless. Though saved by his wife's fortune, he chafed against the quiet dignity of estate life. His passions lay not in governance of land or in the careful stewardship of tradition, but in the thrill of risk, the intoxication of speed and chance. Motor cars drew his fascination, their engines growling like beasts newly loosed upon the earth. Horses, too, remained his companions, their races offering him the fleeting promise of victory and the constant threat of loss. Almina financed it all, her fortune the endless reservoir into which he dipped without pause. Yet she, too, began to seek a purpose beyond the role of financier and hostess. The years of her youth passed, and with them the illusions of romance. In their place grew a determination to be more than a figure whispered about. She established herself as a woman of generosity, a patroness of causes, a mistress who opened Highclere not merely for pleasure, but for service. This spark within her, faint at first, would blaze into full light during the years of war, when the castle would transform into a sanctuary for the wounded. But in these early days it was still forming, still gathering strength, as she wandered the halls and wondered what her life would mean when measured not by whispers, but by deeds. At times, she would stand on the balcony of Highclere, gazing out across the rolling Hampshire fields. The wind would lift her hair, and the calls of birds echoed across the grounds. From that height, the world appeared vast, yet strangely fragile, as though everything, fortune, reputation, love, could vanish with the turning of a season. Did she imagine then the years to come, when this castle, so immense and enduring, would become a memory rather than a home? Did she sense the hollowness of a life bound by wealth, yet hungry for belonging? The portraits of the ancestors watched her still, their eyes unyielding, their presence eternal. In their gaze, she may have sought approval, or perhaps only endured their silent reproach. for in every step she took within Highclere, she knew that her place had been bought, not inherited. And while she wore the title of Countess, the word itself clung to her shoulders like a borrowed cloak, beautiful but never entirely her own. One evening, as the lamps were lit and the castle hushed itself for the night, she paused in the great hall. The silence was immense, broken only by the faint crackle of fire. She touched the carved balustrade, her fingers tracing patterns etched by hands long dead, and for a moment she felt herself less a countess than a guest in some vast museum of lives. The hall stretched above her like a cathedral, and in its shadows the air seemed heavy with unspoken histories. She closed her eyes, listening, as though waiting for the castle itself to reveal what it demanded of her. But the stone did not speak. It only stood, enduring as it always had. And in that silence, she heard again the faint cry of the crows beyond the windows, circling endlessly above the fields, as if reminding her that even within the grandeur of Highclere, shadows remained, circling, waiting. The crows that circled above the fields seemed always to return, their cries weaving themselves into the fabric of her days, as if the air around Highclere carried a reminder of restlessness, of shadows that could never be banished. Within the vast stone walls of the castle, Almina lived surrounded by splendor, yet the echo of those distant wings whispered that she was not free. Highclere Castle, with its soaring towers and endless rooms, was a marvel to the eye of any visitor. The sun would strike its honey-colored stone and set it aglow, while the lawns rolled outward like a sea of green, trimmed and measured by the patient hands of gardeners. Inside, the ceiling stretched high above, painted and carved, echoing with footsteps that seemed too small for such grandeur. The fireplaces roared, the chandeliers sparkled, and the dining tables were laid with silver so polished that candle flames multiplied into 100 glimmers. Guests who entered spoke in admiration, their voices hushed with awe, as if they had stepped into some enchanted palace. Yet for the woman who walked its halls as mistress, the castle was less a palace than a cage, a place where her every movement was observed, where her very presence was a constant performance. Society required her to shine, and shine she did. Almina became known for her wit, her charm, her ability to host gatherings that left guests speaking of Highclere long after they had returned to London. She filled the halls with music, with flowers, with laughter carefully curated, so that each corner of the house seemed alive. To the eyes of the world, she was the countess who had saved her husband's fortune, the young woman who had breathed new life into the ancestral seat. Yet beneath the surface lay a solitude that none could see. For while she could command a room with her smile, when the doors closed at night, she was often left with silence, a silence that no wealth could soften. Her marriage to the Earl grew no warmer with time. He was often absent, absorbed in his pursuits of speed and chance, his fortune once again drained despite her efforts. She remained in the castle, attending to duties, fulfilling the role expected of her, yet receiving little companionship in return. They were husband and wife in name, but in truth they were partners in transaction, bound by necessity rather than devotion. She financed his desires, and he offered her a title. Love had little part to play in the bargain. The whispers of her illegitimacy followed her still. At grand gatherings, there were always those who, behind fans and folded programs, would murmur of her birth, her father, her uncertain place among them. Yet Almina bore it with a composure that was almost defiant. She dressed magnificently, her gowns chosen not only for beauty but for statement. Jewels sparkled at her throat, a reminder that she carried wealth enough to silence mockery, if not to erase it. She spoke with confidence, often disarming critics with her liveliness, for she possessed a spirit that refused to be dimmed. And still, when the guests had departed and the laughter had faded into the night, the truth returned. No ornament, however dazzling, could free her from the invisible bars of her cage. To walk the corridors of Highclere was to feel both majesty and weight. The walls themselves seemed to press inward, filled with the eyes of ancestors staring from painted canvases. Almina felt their scrutiny as she passed, those who had been born into titles, who had never needed to buy their place. She stood among them yet apart, her name added by circumstance, her blood unrecognized by tradition, and though she bore the title of Countess, she carried within her the unshakable sense that she was always being tested, always judged. Perhaps it was this sense of isolation that gave her a yearning for purpose. She found herself drawn to causes beyond the confines of Highclere, small acts of charity, visits to the poor, moments where she might exercise not only her wealth, but her humanity. In the faces of those outside the aristocracy, she saw no judgment of her birth, only gratitude for her kindness. It may be that in these encounters she discovered her first taste of freedom, the freedom of being valued not for her lineage, but for her deeds. Yet still, she returned to the castle, to the routines of dinners, hunts, and entertainments. Guests came and went, leaving behind trails of perfume and echoes of laughter. The Earl continued in his pursuits, growing more reckless, his appetite for risk consuming all in its path. Almina remained steadfast, providing the means to sustain it all, though in her heart she must have wondered how long such a balance could last. The cage, gilded though it was, grew heavier with each passing year. At times she would retreat to the gardens, walking among roses and yews, breathing the cool air beneath ancient trees. There, away from the endless scrutiny of halls and portraits, she could imagine herself another woman, one free of obligation, free of whispers, free of the burden of sustaining a lineage that had not welcomed her fully. She might pause beside the lake, watching the ripples spread across the water, and ask herself quietly, was this truly her life, or merely the role she had been assigned? The water, of course, gave no answer, only mirrored her reflection, a reflection adorned with jewels and titles, yet with eyes that betrayed weariness. And so her days moved forward, one after another, a pattern of appearances and silences, of gatherings and loneliness. Highclere shone to the world as a beacon of grandeur, yet within its walls lived a woman who, though surrounded by wealth, remained caged by expectation. The gilded bars of her prison gleamed, but they were bars all the same. One night, as the lamps were extinguished and the corridors grew dark, she lingered by a window. Beyond, the field stretched in shadow, and again she heard the crows calling, their wings cutting across the moonlit sky. They circled endlessly, as if bound to the air above Highclere, never landing, never resting. Their cries pierced the night, a reminder that freedom lay always beyond reach, just out of hand. She pressed her palm against the cold glass, listening, her breath misting the pain, and wondered whether those dark shapes outside were an omen or a mirror of her own restless soul. The crows drifted farther into the distance, their voices fading until only silence remained, and within that silence she felt the weight of her cage more deeply than ever before. The silence that followed the fading of the crows lingered in the chambers of Highclere like a breath held too long. It was a silence that seemed to grow heavier with each passing year, pressing itself into the stone, seeping into the corridors. Yet within that stillness came the sound of distant thunder, not from the skies, but from the rumbling tides of history. For the world beyond Highclere was changing, the old order shifting, and soon the thunder would break into a storm that touched every family, every house, every life. When war came in 1914, it shattered the silence, and within its ruin, Lady Almina found something unexpected, not another cage, but a calling. From the moment the first reports reached England, The guns firing in Belgium, the mobilization of troops, the somber march of young men across the fields, there spread a sense that life could not go on as it had. The gilded evenings, the endless banquets, the languid weekends in country houses suddenly felt like relics of a vanished age. The war was not only fought at the front, but reshaped the very pulse of the nation. It demanded sacrifice, and even the wealthy, who so often remained at a careful distance from hardship, were forced to confront the suffering that crept into every corner of the land. For Almina, the war became the turning of a key. Highclere Castle. Once the stage of glittering parties and shallow gaieties, she transformed into a place of service, a hospital for the wounded. It was not a symbolic gesture, but a genuine act, born of both her wealth and her will. The great rooms, once adorned with silks and tapestries for the delight of guests, now held rows of beds, their white sheets stark against dark paneling. The scent of perfume gave way to the sharp tang of disinfectant, the perfume of flowers replaced by the sterility of ether and carbolic. The soldiers arrived broken, some carried on stretchers, others hobbling with canes, their uniforms torn, their bodies bearing wounds that spoke of mud, barbed wire, and unrelenting fire. Into this place of aristocratic grandeur they were brought, and here they were, tended not by distant figures of authority, but by the Countess herself. Almina walked among the beds, her small frame moving with quick purpose, her voice gentle yet firm. She provided not only the means, but the presence, sitting by the wounded, writing letters for them, offering a hand where pain left them unable to hold a pen. Those who saw her at work spoke of her tireless devotion. She spared no expense, ensuring the best doctors were brought, that every comfort available was provided. She wore not the silks of society, but the plain garments of a nurse, moving through corridors that echoed not with laughter, but with groans, whispered prayers, and the steady tread of attendants. And within this transformation of Highclere, she herself seemed to change. For the first time, the whispers of her birth mattered little. Here, among broken men, titles and scandals dissolved. She was not judged by lineage, but by compassion, not by inheritance, but by service. Did she find in this labor a kind of redemption, a quiet answer to the questions that had followed her all her life? Or was it simply necessity, the inevitability of her station that she must serve in some visible way? Perhaps both truths coexist, as they so often do. Yet what is certain is that in the long nights of tending the wounded, in the smell of bandages and the soft lamplight that glowed against stone walls, Almina stepped beyond the role of ornament and into the role of healer. One imagines her pausing by a window after hours, removing her gloves, her hands tired, her dress marked by the day's labors. Beyond the glass, the lawns of Highclere stretched as before, unchanged, serene. Yet within, the castle bore scars of its own. The groans that had filled its halls, the prayers whispered into the dark, the sudden silences when lives ended quietly beneath its roof. The walls that had once confined her now seemed to echo with her own heartbeat, reminding her that purpose could bloom even within a cage. Still, the war was relentless, and the losses uncountable. Letters of thanks arrived from families whose sons had been tended at Highclere, yet so too did letters of grief from those whose loved ones had not returned. Almina, who had once been spoken of only in the language of wealth and scandal, now appeared in a different light, a woman who gave of herself to ease suffering. And perhaps in these years, she touched something of the freedom she had always sought, the freedom to define herself not by whispers, but by deeds. Yet behind this newfound purpose lay the same reality as before. The Earl remained distant, consumed by his own pursuits. Though he supported the transformation of the castle, he was not drawn to the same devotion as his wife. Their marriage continued as it had, a partnership of necessity rather than intimacy. And when the guns of the war finally fell silent, when the wounded no longer filled the halls, the castle returned slowly to its old rhythm, though forever changed by what it had borne. The silence after war was not the silence of peace, but of absence. The great rooms, empty of beds, seemed to echo with memory. Almina walked them still, and perhaps in the quiet she heard again the groans, the whispered thanks, the footsteps of men long gone. Highclere was once more a place of grandeur, yet it had also become a place of ghosts. In those years after the war, Almina carried within her both the strength she had discovered and the fatigue of what she had endured. The cage remained, its bars unchanged, but within it she had carved a small space of her own choosing. Yet shadows lingered still, for the Earl, restless and dissatisfied, began to turn his eyes farther afield, toward lands beyond England, toward a desert where secrets slept beneath the sands. One evening, as she extinguished the lamps and the corridors darkened into stillness, Almina paused again by the window. The fields lay hushed beneath the night sky, and from the distance came the faint call of a bird, not the restless crows this time, but the lonely cry of an owl drifting across the lawns. Its voice lingered in the darkness, carrying with it an omen of journeys yet to come, journeys that would lead her husband away from Highclere and into the sands of Egypt, where destiny itself seemed to wait in silence. The owl's lonely cry drifted across the fields, fading into the stillness of night, and in its fading, one could almost sense the shape of a restlessness that belonged not to the bird alone, but to the man who carried the title of Earl of Carnarvon. George Herbert, the fifth Earl, was a figure never fully content within the confines of tradition. The castle that his wife had restored, the lands that bore his family's name, even the duties expected of his station, these were not enough to steady his spirit. He was a man pulled toward motion, toward risk, toward pursuits that promised excitement and danger in equal measure. And though Almina's wealth had saved his estate from ruin, it also gave him the freedom to indulge that restlessness without restraint. His earliest passions had been for horses, the creatures whose power and speed mirrored his own hunger for movement. Racecourses became his haunts, the pounding of hooves echoing the pounding of his heart as he watched fortunes won and lost in moments. Yet the thrill of the track was never enough to satisfy for long. Gambling accompanied it. Cards and wagers played out in smoky rooms where laughter carried the edge of desperation. Money slipped through his fingers as easily as sand, yet always there was more, for Almina's fortune stood behind him like an inexhaustible reservoir. With the turn of the century came a new fascination. The motor car, that roaring machine of steel and fire that seemed to break open the future itself. The Earl was among its earliest enthusiasts, one of those who saw in its speed not merely a novelty, but a promise of liberation. He drove recklessly, the wind whipping his hair, the countryside flashing past in a blur of hedges and stone walls. Yet it was not long before this passion nearly claimed his life. A crash left him grievously injured, his body marked by pain that never fully healed. From then on, he would live with frailty, plagued by bouts of ill health, yet even this did not curb his appetite for adventure. If anything, the shadow of mortality seemed only to sharpen his desire to seize what experiences he could before time denied him. Almina watched, as she had always done, providing the means for these pursuits, yet receiving little in return. Her role remained the same: financier, supporter, silent guarantor of his risks. She, who had given Highclere a new purpose during the war, now found herself once again standing in the wings, her husband absorbed by obsessions that left little room for companionship. Did she resent it? Did she feel herself diminished by his constant taking, his constant drifting toward excitement beyond her reach? Or did she, perhaps, accept it as the pattern of her marriage, a pattern she could no longer hope to change? The Earl's restlessness, however, soon turned towards something different, something that would carry his name far beyond the racecourses and clubs of England. Egypt called to him, that land of desert winds and silent tombs, where ancient kings lay beneath the sand and mysteries whispered through broken stone. It was a fascination that had taken hold among Europeans for decades, the allure of antiquity, the dream of discovery. For the Earl, it became not merely a curiosity, but an obsession. He began to finance excavations, employing archaeologists to seek what had been buried for thousands of years. And as always, it was Almina's wealth that made it possible. Howard Carter entered his life at this time, the archaeologist whose skill and persistence would prove fateful. Together, the Earl and Carter embarked upon a quest that many dismissed as futile. For countless tombs had already been uncovered, and skeptics believed little remained to be found. Yet the Earl's restless spirit latched onto the search with determination. Egypt offered him something the racecourse could not, the promise of immortality, of being remembered not merely as a reckless aristocrat, but as a patron of discovery, a man tied forever to history itself. Almina, however, remained far from the desert. She financed the expeditions but did not accompany him, her role once again that of provider rather than partner. At Highclere, she continued her routines, perhaps feeling the emptiness of halls that had once rung with the cries of wounded soldiers, but now echoed only with her own footsteps. The castle seemed to slip back into silence, while across the sea her husband pursued a dream beneath the Egyptian sun. And yet, for all his passion, the Earl remained haunted by frailty. His body, never fully recovered from the accident, grew weaker. Illness shadowed him, and those around him noticed his pallor, his weariness, even as his determination did not falter. It was as though he sensed that his time was limited, and that the sands of Egypt were his final chance to seize meaning. One can imagine Almina, standing again at the windows of Highclere, gazing out at the lawns while thinking of her husband far away in the desert. Did she envy the freedom that took him so far from her? Did she fear the dangers of such journeys, or did she welcome the distance they created between them? Silence gives no answers, but the questions linger, carried like the restless flight of birds across the night sky. The Earl's pursuits were costly, draining more and more of the fortune that had once seemed unending. Lawsuits over debts, constant demands for funds, these became the rhythm of Almina's life, as she signed papers, authorized payments, and tried to steady what always threatened to collapse. Yet she endured, as she always had, the quiet strength behind his restlessness. The gilded cage that bound her grew no lighter, but within it she had discovered her own resilience, her own capacity to endure solitude, judgment, and disappointment. The owl's cry that had once drifted across the fields of Highclere might have seemed, in hindsight, a herald of what was to come, for soon the Earl's restless spirit would find its ultimate stage, a stage not of England but of Egypt, where the tomb of a forgotten boy king lay sealed in darkness, waiting for the hand that dared disturb it. And as the seasons turned and Almina continued her quiet walk through the echoing corridors of the castle, the winds of the desert began to rise, carrying with them the promise of triumph and the shadow of tragedy. The winds of the desert rose in whispers, carrying grains of sand that drifted like time itself across the shifting landscape of Egypt. These were winds that spoke not in words, but in silence, a silence heavy with the weight of centuries. To the Earl of Carnarvon, restless and yearning, the desert was more than a place. It was a promise. Beneath its golden surface lay secrets older than empires, treasures untouched by light, and stories waiting to be awakened. In that silence, he heard the call of destiny, a call he could not resist. Egyptology had become, by the turn of the 20th century, both fascination and spectacle. Scholars, adventurers, and fortune-seekers alike descended upon the Nile, driven by dreams of uncovering the lost world of the pharaohs. Tombs had been opened, treasures displayed in European museums, and tales of curses whispered in drawing rooms far away. Yet for many, the golden age of discovery was thought to be ending, the great finds already claimed by earlier hands. To Lord Carnarvon, however, this only deepened the allure. He believed that something still lay hidden, something that could etch his name into the annals of history. It was in Howard Carter that he found his companion for this quest. Carter was not of noble birth, but he carried within him a determination as unyielding as the desert rock. Trained as an artist, hardened by years of excavation, he was both meticulous and relentless, qualities that balanced the Earl's restless eagerness. Together, they formed an unlikely partnership, the aristocrat with means and the archaeologist with vision. Yet as always, behind them stood Almina, her wealth underwriting the dream, her fortune poured into the sands though her feet never touched them. One imagines her sitting within the high windows of Highclere, reading letters from Egypt written in her husband's uneven hand. He spoke of heat and dust, of workers digging under the unrelenting sun, of fragments of pottery and walls etched with hieroglyphs. Perhaps he wrote with excitement, perhaps with desperation, for the years stretched on and no great treasure appeared. Almina read these letters in rooms filled with English twilight, the scent of roses drifting from the gardens, a sharp contrast to the desert winds her husband described. Did she feel pride in supporting such an endeavor, or did she feel only the weight of yet another fortune slipping from her hands? The silence of history does not tell, but one can imagine the quiet sigh with which she folded each letter, setting it aside as she returned to the duties of her life. The Earl's health, never strong after his accident, fared poorly in Egypt's climate. He often returned to England weakened, pale, coughing from dust and fever. Yet each time he was drawn back, compelled by a belief that the desert still held something for him. His frailty seemed only to intensify his urgency, as if he sensed that time itself pressed against him. And Almina, though she must have seen the toll it took, did not prevent him. She continued to fund his journeys, to sign the checks that made possible the wages of laborers, the purchase of supplies, the endless persistence of Carter's excavations. The desert became a mirror of the Earl's own spirit, harsh, unyielding, filled with silence and shadow, yet carrying within it the promise of glory. Day after day, Carter directed teams of men, their tools striking against earth that had not been disturbed for millennia. The sun beat down, the air shimmered, and progress was slow, almost imperceptible. Seasons passed, years passed. Other excavators mocked their efforts, declaring the Valley of the Kings exhausted. But Carter believed otherwise, and the Earl, to his credit, continued to trust him. Meanwhile, in England, Almina's life unfolded in quieter rhythms. Highclere remained her domain, its halls less lively than in former days. She hosted when required, maintained appearances, but much of her energy had been spent during the war years, and her spirit seemed less inclined to the pageantry of aristocracy. Perhaps she found in solitude a certain peace, or perhaps it was only resignation. She was bound by her role, bound by expectation, yet her thoughts must have wandered often to Egypt, where her husband's fate seemed increasingly entwined with the sands. And then, after years of frustration, came a shift. In November of 1922, Carter sent word that at last they had found something, a stairway cut into the rock, sealed and hidden, leading downward into darkness. The Earl hurried to Egypt, frail yet determined, his long pursuit nearing its culmination. Almina did not accompany him. She remained in England, waiting as she always had, the financier of a dream she would not witness with her own eyes. One wonders whether she felt relief at the news or apprehension. for the discovery of a tomb carried not only promise, but danger. The winds of the desert must have seemed to whisper louder that season, carrying with them a sense of inevitability. The Earl, standing with Carter before the sealed doorway, must have felt the weight of all his restless years converging in that moment. Behind that door lay not only treasure, but destiny. Yet far away, in the quiet chambers of Highclere, Almina perhaps stood again at the window, listening to the night sounds of England, unaware that her husband was about to step into the pages of history and into a tragedy that would leave her more alone than ever before. That night in the desert, when Carter held a candle to peer through the broken seal, and the Earl asked what he saw, the words, "wonderful things," were spoken. And indeed, wonderful they were. Golden statues, chests, furniture, objects untouched by time, the preserved glory of a boy king, long forgotten. It was the triumph of centuries, the discovery that would electrify the world. But triumph has always carried within it the seed of downfall, and the sands of Egypt are never generous without exacting their price. As news spread, voices across Europe stirred with awe. Newspapers carried the story, and suddenly the name of Carnarvon was tied forever to Tutankhamun. Yet in England, Almina must have received the tidings with a complex heart. The discovery was her husband's, but it was also hers, funded by the fortune she had carried into his life. And still she remained a figure in the shadows, distant from the triumph, bound to it, but not celebrated by it. Such is often the fate of those who give without recognition, their contributions hidden even as the world marvels at the result. The desert winds grew restless once more, as if aware that triumph could not endure without tragedy. For within months the Earl would lie fevered and dying in a Cairo hotel room, his restless spirit at last overtaken by the frailty he had carried for so long. And in that moment the sands of Egypt would claim their due, leaving Almina again to face the silence, this time not of a cage, but of widowhood. The first flicker of candlelight that pierced the darkness beyond the sealed doorway revealed gold, a glimmer that shimmered like captured sunlight, though no sun had touched it for 3,000 years. Howard Carter, bending forward, steadied his hand as the flame trembled in the still air, and behind him the Earl of Carnarvon leaned closer, his breath caught with anticipation. "Can you see anything?" he asked, his voice tight with the weight of years of failure and hope. Carter, his eyes widening, answered simply, "Yes, wonderful things." And with those words the silence of centuries was broken. The tomb of Tutankhamun awakened, its treasures revealed not to priests or kings, but to two men whose footsteps echoed in the Valley of the Kings on a November evening in 1922. It was a triumph beyond imagining. Chests inlaid with ivory, golden statues, alabaster vessels, a bed shaped like a lion, and everywhere the sheen of treasure untouched by time. The walls themselves seemed to breathe with secrets, painted with figures whose eyes stared into eternity. In that moment, the Earl stood at the edge of immortality, his name bound forever to the boy king whose rest he had disturbed. The newspapers soon carried the tale to every corner of the globe, and in London, in Paris, in New York, people spoke the name Carnarvon with awe. The discovery was hailed as the greatest archaeological triumph of the age, yet triumph is rarely without shadow. From the first glimmer of gold, whispers of unease spread like smoke. The ancient tomb had been sealed for millennia, guarded by prayers and curses long forgotten. To disturb it was to trespass into the realm of the dead, and many wondered whether a price would be exacted. In drawing rooms across England, talk of the Pharaoh's curse began, half in jest, half in fear, the kind of whisper that grows stronger in repetition. And in Highclere, far from the sands of Egypt, Almina must have heard the stories with a tightening of her heart, for she knew her husband's health was already fragile, and superstition, whether true or false, often seems to trail those already marked by fate. For Almina, the triumph was distant, her role unspoken. It was her fortune that had sustained Carter's persistence, her wealth that had carried her husband through years of excavation. Without her, there would have been no candlelight, no whispered, wonderful things. And yet her name was scarcely mentioned in the flood of reports. She was the shadow behind the glory, her presence invisible though her contribution had been essential. Perhaps she accepted this silence as she had so often accepted it before. Or perhaps she sat alone in the vast drawing room of Highclere, reading accounts of the discovery, and felt the old ache of being both indispensable and overlooked. The Earl, meanwhile, basked in the glow of triumph. Though his body ached and illness clung to him, his spirit soared. To stand at the threshold of Tutankhamun's tomb was to stand at the crossroads of history, his name now written into the story of Egypt's eternal kings. Yet triumph can be blinding, and he did not see, or did not wish to see, the shadow that followed close behind. For in those first weeks after the discovery, as treasures were catalogued and chambers prepared for further opening, he fell ill in Cairo. A mosquito bite upon his cheek grew infected, and fever took hold. Within days, his strength collapsed, and the whispers of curse grew louder. On April 5, 1923, George Edward Stanhope Molyneux Herbert, 5th Earl of Carnarvon, died, far from the green fields of Hampshire, far from the castle his wife had sustained, alone in a foreign hotel as the desert winds moved beyond his window. The world gasped at the news. To many, it was proof of the curse, the Pharaoh's vengeance upon the intruder who had dared to break the seal. Newspapers filled their pages with speculation, recounting the coincidence of the lights going out in Cairo at the moment of his death, retelling stories of ancient maledictions inscribed upon tombs. The Earl became not only the patron of discovery, but also its first victim, his name tied forever to both glory and doom. And what of Almina? In England, the news reached her, and with it must have come a flood of conflicting emotions. She had lost her husband, though whether she lost love is another question. Their marriage had been one of necessity, of bargain more than tenderness, and his absence had often weighed less than his presence. Yet he was still the man to whom her life had been bound for nearly 3 decades, the man whose debts she had paid, whose ambitions she had supported, whose fate she had shared. Now he was gone, leaving her not only in widowhood, but in a storm of speculation, scandal, and uncertainty. Did she grieve him? Surely she grieved something. The ending of a bond, however flawed, the finality of death, however expected, the sight of a chapter closing, however painful its pages had been. And yet alongside grief must have come fear, for with his death came questions of inheritance, of fortune, of survival. The fortune she had once possessed in abundance was no longer secure, drained by years of extravagance and relentless pursuits. The castle she had saved might yet slip from her grasp. Even in widowhood, the whispers of uncertainty circled her like the crows above Highclere. The image of the open tomb, its treasures gleaming in candlelight, remained in the minds of the world. For Almina, however, that image must have been inseparable from the sight of her husband's name, now forever tied to death, his triumph eclipsed by his demise. She was left to walk once more the corridors of Highclere, their silence heavier than ever, carrying the knowledge that her life had shifted yet again, from wife to widow, from benefactor to survivor. And outside, the winds rose across the desert, blowing fine sand against the sealed doorway of the tomb, as if Egypt itself sought to remind those who disturbed it that all glory is fleeting, all triumph shadowed, all awakenings accompanied by loss. The winds that swept over the Valley of the Kings in the days after the Earl's passing carried with them a silence unlike any other, a silence not of peace, but of unease, as though the desert itself had drawn a breath it would never release. In Cairo, the hotel where he had succumbed to fever became the center of rumor, its corridors heavy with the murmur of journalists and onlookers, all eager to seize upon the tale of a curse. The body of George Herbert, the 5th Earl of Carnarvon, lay shrouded in stillness, his face marked by the infection that had claimed him, while beyond the window the city bustled with the usual life of merchants and carriages, the cries of hawkers, the bells of donkeys, indifferent to the fate of one more Englishman felled upon their soil. His death spread across the world with the swiftness of lightning. Newspapers printed lurid tales of the curse of the pharaoh, embellishing with every retelling. They spoke of the lights of Cairo flickering out at the moment of his last breath, of his dog in England howling and dying at the same hour, of ancient inscriptions warning of vengeance to those who entered the tomb. Whether true or false mattered little. The world was enchanted by the mystery, and the name Carnarvon was spoken not in admiration alone, but in awe tinged with dread. Far from the desert, in the stillness of Highclere, Almina received the news. She was now a widow, though not in the usual sense of that word. Widowhood often brings the memory of tender love lost, of companionship severed, but Almina's marriage had been built on transaction, survival, and endurance. What she lost was not intimacy, but a presence that had defined her existence nonetheless. The Earl's ambitions had dictated her life for nearly 30 years, and with his death, she was left not with freedom, but with uncertainty. The funeral, when his body was returned to England, carried all the pomp expected of his rank. Yet even in mourning, whispers circulated among the mourners. Some muttered of curses, others of debts, others still of the strange destiny that had carried him from the quiet fields of Hampshire to the sands of Egypt and then to the grave. Almina, dressed in black, moved with dignity through the ceremonies, her face unreadable. Did she feel sorrow, or relief, or simply exhaustion? The silence she kept allowed others to project their own interpretations upon her. She had long lived in the space between truth and perception, and widowhood did not alter that. What did change was her position. With the Earl gone, questions of inheritance and fortune immediately pressed upon her. The title passed to their son, Henry, now the 6th Earl of Carnarvon, but the wealth that had once seemed inexhaustible had been eroded by years of extravagance, by gambling, by motor cars, by expeditions across the desert. Creditors circled, lawsuits began to stir, and Almina found herself once again fighting to protect what she had already given so much to sustain. And then there was the scandal, for the Earl's death had not only drawn superstition, but also gossip of a more earthly kind. Stories emerged of debts unpaid, of reckless ventures, of questionable associations. His triumph in discovering Tutankhamun's tomb was overshadowed by the manner of his end, and Almina, as his widow, was forced to bear the weight of these whispers. It was not the first time she had been burdened by scandal, nor would it be the last. She had entered the world as a whisper, and it seemed she would forever be pursued by them. Yet within the storm, she carried herself with the same poise she always had. She returned to Highclere, to the vast halls now emptier than ever, and resumed her life with a determination that seemed almost defiant. She had faced whispers since birth. She had faced isolation in marriage. She had faced the endless demands of fortune and expectation. Widowhood, with all its complications, was merely another trial, and still she endured. The tomb in Egypt remained sealed, its wonders still largely hidden, guarded now by Carter and the authorities. The Earl had glimpsed eternity, but had not lived to see it fully revealed. Almina must have thought often of this irony that he had chased glory for so long only to die at the very threshold of it. Perhaps she felt bitterness, or perhaps she saw in it a strange justice, the fulfillment of a destiny that had always been restless, reckless, unfinished. His life had been a pursuit of more speed, more risk, more discovery. And it was fitting, in a way, that death came not in quiet old age, but in the fevered heat of Cairo, on the edge of history. In the still evenings at Highclere, when the lamps burned low and the corridors stretched into shadow, Almina might have sat alone and listened to the silence that seemed to echo with the ghosts of her own past. The crows no longer circled as they once had, but in their place came the murmurs of memory. The young bride stepping into the castle for the first time, the wounded soldiers in the great hall, the letters from Egypt filled with dust and hope, the news of death carried across seas. Widowhood did not end her story. It only marked another transformation. Yet transformations are rarely kind. The fortune she had inherited from her father, Alfred de Rothschild, was not endless. Already strained by decades of expenditure, it now faced new threats. Lawsuits from creditors, challenges to her husband's estate, and the ever-present costs of maintaining Highclere all pressed against her. The world saw her as a woman of immense wealth, yet in truth, her position was precarious. She was at once rich and vulnerable, powerful and besieged. The newspapers, which had once ignored her, now sought her name, for scandal clings to widows as easily as it does to debutantes. They speculated on her future, on her finances, on her role in the unfolding legacy of the tomb. But Almina remained silent, as she had always done, moving with dignity through the storm, bearing the weight of whispers without reply. And yet, in the silence of her widowhood, perhaps she asked herself the question that had haunted her life. What had it all been for? She had brought her husband the fortune that saved his castle, that financed his pursuits, that enabled the discovery of the greatest treasure of the age. And in return, she was left with debts, with scandal, with a legacy that remembered him, but not her. Was that not, in its own way, the most tragic irony? That she, who had given everything, remained a shadow in the story. As the years pressed forward, the tomb of Tutankhamun continued to reveal its wonders, dazzling the world with gold and mystery. The Earl's name was tied forever to that discovery, his death immortalized as the first victim of a pharaoh's curse. But for Almina, widowhood was not filled with gold or immortality. It was filled with silence, with struggles, with the relentless effort to survive. And in that silence, as she walked once more the grounds of Highclere, the wind stirred through the ancient trees, carrying not the cry of crows nor the whisper of owls, but a stillness that seemed to wait for the next shadow to fall upon her life. The silence that lingered at Highclere after the Earl's death was not the soft silence of peace, but a sharpened quiet, a silence that seemed to vibrate with questions, with expectation, with the uneasy gaze of a society that had turned its eyes toward Almina. For she was no longer simply the Countess of Carnarvon, no longer merely the woman whose fortune had sustained a fading lineage. She was now the widow of the man whose name was forever bound to Tutankhamun's tomb, the woman linked by circumstance to both the glory of discovery and the scandal of death. And in that role, the world pressed closer, its whispers louder, its scrutiny unrelenting. Her widowhood was unlike that of most women of her rank. She did not withdraw quietly from society, cloaked in mourning and solitude. Instead, she remained visible, present, still dressed in finery, still entertaining, still moving through the circles that had once judged her. To many, it seemed defiant, a refusal to retreat, a determination to maintain her place regardless of scandal. But beneath the glitter, there lay the familiar loneliness that had long haunted her. For even surrounded by admirers, she was alone, her marriage gone, her fortune diminished, her name spoken more in curiosity than in reverence. The discovery of the tomb had made her late husband immortal, but immortality is rarely shared. Carter's name appeared in endless accounts, the Earl's in countless headlines, but Almina's was scarcely mentioned. When it was as a footnote, a shadow, a curiosity. She had funded it all, yet remained largely invisible in its telling. And so, as society marveled at the treasures of Tutankhamun, the golden mask, the jeweled amulets, the chariots buried in sand, it overlooked the woman who had made their unearthing possible. This invisibility was a burden she knew too well, for it had been her life's refrain, indispensable yet disregarded, central yet peripheral. Still, she continued to live with extravagance, perhaps out of habit, perhaps out of defiance, perhaps as a way of insisting upon her own presence in a world that sought to diminish her. Her gowns remained exquisite, her jewels dazzling, her gatherings lavish. Highclere, though quieter, still bore traces of grandeur, its rooms filled at times with laughter and music that seemed determined to drown out the whispers. But extravagance could not conceal truth. Behind the silks and candles lay debts, lawsuits, the slow erosion of wealth. She lived as though the Rothschild fortune were endless, but even the deepest reservoir can run dry when endlessly drained. Loneliness, too, pressed against her. The Earl had not been a tender companion, yet he had been a presence, someone whose restlessness had filled the silence with movement. Without him, the vast halls of Highclere felt emptier than ever, their echoes deeper, their shadows longer. She filled them with guests, with sound, with distraction, but at night, when the lamps dimmed and the corridors stretched into darkness, she was left with herself. And in that solitude, she must have asked what her life had truly been, a sacrifice to a lineage that never fully embraced her, a fortune poured into ventures that left her with little, a name remembered only in whispers. The world, however, was not content to leave her in peace. The newspapers that had once ignored her now followed her with curiosity, eager for stories of the widow of the man claimed by the pharaoh's curse. They reported on her appearance, on her entertainments, on her finances, always with a tone of speculation. Was she ruined? Was she still rich? Was she still beautiful? Was she still the shadow behind Highclere? She became a figure of fascination not because of who she was, but because of who she had been tied to. Her identity remained derivative, bound to the Earl, bound to scandal, bound to fortune and its loss. And yet in her way she resisted this reduction. She moved through society with confidence, her voice still lively, her manner still gracious. She laughed, she hosted, she gave generously to causes. There was strength in her refusal to be diminished, even as the world judged her. Perhaps it was pride, perhaps resilience, perhaps simply survival. Whatever its source, it was her shield against the loneliness that pressed closer with each passing year. At times, though, one imagines her stepping away from the noise of gatherings, retreating to a quiet corner of the castle or the garden, and there allowing herself to feel the weight of it all. The fortune nearly gone, the husband dead in a foreign land, the whispers unending, the knowledge that she had been at the center of history, yet her name barely spoken in its telling. In such moments, perhaps she felt the same ache that had shadowed her since childhood, the ache of being seen but not recognized, of being necessary but not celebrated, of being forever half hidden. The tomb in Egypt continued to reveal its wonders, each new object a marvel, each new chamber a revelation. The world's fascination deepened, and the Earl's name remained tied to it, immortal in the annals of discovery. For Almina, widowhood meant living in the long shadow of that immortality, a shadow that seemed to stretch endlessly, reminding her that she was bound to a legacy that excluded her, even as it depended on her. It was a cruel irony, but one she bore as she had borne so many others. One evening, as she stood upon the terrace of Highclere, the twilight deepening around her, she gazed out over the lawns that stretched into the horizon. The air was cool, the sky tinged with the fading glow of the sun, and the silence of the grounds was vast. Somewhere in the distance a fox barked, its cry sharp against the stillness. She closed her eyes and listened, and in that sound she heard not only the loneliness of the present, but the echo of all that had been lost. The Earl, the fortune, the years of purpose, the illusions of belonging. Widowhood was not merely a state of being alone. It was the culmination of a life spent in shadows, a life given to others and reclaimed only in fragments. The fox's cry faded, and the silence deepened once more. She turned back into the castle, her figure framed by the great doorway, her steps steady despite the weight she carried. And within that silence, the questions lingered still. Was she remembered or forgotten? Was she survivor or victim? Was she free or still caged? The silence that followed her, turned back into the castle, was heavy, as though the very stones carried the weight of debts unspoken. For silence can conceal many things, and among them, the slow erosion of fortune is the most relentless. Almina had long lived with the illusion of abundance, for the Rothschild inheritance had seemed vast beyond measure, a reservoir that could never run dry. Yet wealth is like sand held in the palm. It slips through even the most careful fingers. And in her case, it was scattered by decades of indulgence, of rescues, of ambitions not her own. Widowhood did not free her from this truth. It sharpened it. Her father's gift, so lavish in its beginning, had been both blessing and curse. It had granted her entrance into a world that would otherwise have kept its gates shut against her, had given her jewels, gowns, houses, and the means to sustain the great castle of Highclere. Yet it had also made her the target of expectation, of dependence, of endless demands. The Earl had drawn upon it for his racing, his gambling, his motor cars, his excavations. The war had consumed it through her hospital at Highclere, noble in purpose, but costly in reality. And now, with the Earl gone, creditors pressed against her door, their patience long since exhausted. Lawsuits followed her like shadows, each one another stone upon her shoulders. Promissory notes, unpaid accounts, debts incurred for ventures she had not chosen, all of them bore her name. In courtrooms, her dignity remained intact, but within, she must have felt the sting of humiliation, the knowledge that she, once thought inexhaustibly rich, was now exposed as vulnerable. The newspapers, ever eager for scandal, reported each case, each judgment, each whisper of ruin. For society delights in watching the mighty stumble, and the fall of a countess once bathed in Rothschild wealth was spectacle enough to fill their columns. And yet Almina did not retreat. She continued to dress in elegance, to host when she could, to maintain the appearance of stability. Pride, perhaps, or survival, likely both, kept her moving forward. She had learned early in life that to falter was to invite disdain, that appearances were as essential as breath in the world she inhabited. So she smiled, she conversed, she gave the impression of a woman still in command, even as the foundation beneath her crumbled. Highclere itself remained a symbol of this paradox. The castle stood magnificent, its towers piercing the sky, its grounds as vast as ever. Yet within, the cost of its maintenance gnawed relentlessly. Servants' wages, repairs, taxes, each demanded funds that were no longer plentiful. She had once saved it with her dowry, pouring her father's fortune into its survival. But now she could not rescue it again. The great halls that had echoed with music and laughter now seemed heavy with memory. The silence between their walls no longer gilded, but burdened. To walk them was to feel the weight of what had been lost, of what could not be sustained. There is a peculiar cruelty in wealth. It promises permanence, yet it is fragile. It dazzles, yet it blinds. For Almina, the burden was not only in the loss, but in the memory of abundance. To have once had everything and then to watch it dissolve is a deeper sorrow than never having possessed it at all. She had tasted the sweetness of privilege, but also its bitterness. And now in widowhood she found herself balanced between illusion and truth. Still, she was not without spirit. She argued her cases. She fought for her rights. She defended her reputation with vigor. Those who expected her to collapse under the weight of scandal found instead a woman who, though wounded, would not yield easily. Perhaps this resilience was her truest inheritance, not the Rothschild gold, but the determination to endure. For endurance had been the thread of her life from the beginning, binding her through whispers of illegitimacy, through loveless marriage, through war, through widowhood, and now through financial ruin. And yet resilience cannot banish loneliness. She continued to move in society, her presence noted, her beauty still admired, but admiration is not companionship. Behind the sparkle of jewels lay the quiet ache of solitude, the knowledge that she was seen but not known, desired but not cherished, admired but not loved. Wealth had brought her into the spotlight, but it had not brought her the warmth of belonging. At times, one imagines her walking the long gallery of Highclere, the portraits of past generations watching from their frames. Their eyes, painted centuries earlier, seemed to follow her, stern and unyielding. They had been born to their inheritance. She had bought her place among them. Did she feel their judgment as she passed, or did she meet their gaze with defiance, as if to say that she had endured more than any of them could know? The gallery stretched into shadow, and in its silence the burden of her life seemed etched into every step. The Rothschild fortune had promised stability, but it had instead bound her to endless obligation. Even in widowhood she was pursued not by freedom, but by claims, by expectations, by debts that never ceased. It was as though the fortune itself had been cursed, not by pharaohs, but by the very society that demanded its constant sacrifice. For wealth, in her world, was never a shield. It was a leash. And still she walked forward, her head held high, her footsteps steady upon the stone. Pride remained her armor, dignity her final jewel. Yet within, she must have felt the hollowness growing, the emptiness of halls once filled with life, the slow fading of the illusion that had carried her for so long. One evening, as twilight settled upon the grounds, she stood once more at a window. The lawns stretched outward, the air still, the sky deepening into indigo. In the distance, the faint cry of a bird reached her, not the restless crows nor the lonely owl, but the shrill call of a gull carried inland by strange winds. It was a sound foreign to Highclere, unsettling, as though the sea itself had reached into the heart of the countryside to remind her that nothing remains unmoved, that even stone castles and ancient names can shift and dissolve. She listened until the cry faded, leaving only silence. And in that silence, she felt the weight of her fortune, not as gift, but as burden, not as promise, but as curse. The cry of the gull, carried inland upon strange winds, seemed to linger long after its sound had faded, an alien voice echoing in the heart of the countryside. To Almina, it was as if the sea itself had intruded upon the sanctuary of Highclere, reminding her that the world beyond her estate still shifted and pulled with unfamiliar tides. It was in such tides that she found herself swept again, for widowhood, with all its silence and solitude, left her not immune to longing. She had endured decades of a marriage defined more by transaction than tenderness, and though her husband's absence had not pierced her heart with grief, as it might another widow's, it had left her with a hollow space. Into that space entered the thought, fragile yet persistent. Might love, or at least companionship, still be possible? It was Colonel Ian Onslow Denistone who offered an answer. A man of military bearing, with charm enough to disarm and presence enough to command attention, he was far from the world of scholars and gamblers her first husband had inhabited. To Almina, he appeared as a chance at something different, perhaps even a chance at the intimacy she had never truly known. Their marriage in 1923, so soon after the Earl's death, raised eyebrows, as society always finds cause to murmur. Yet Almina was no stranger to whispers. She had been born into them, lived among them, and worn them like an invisible cloak. What difference did a few more make? For a time, the union seemed to offer her a reprieve from loneliness. She was no longer the solitary widow, nor the figure drifting through empty halls, shadowed by debts and memories. She was again a wife, a partner, a woman who could stand beside a man without the weight of scandalous absence. Perhaps she even felt a spark of joy, a brief light flickering in the long twilight of her life. Yet the flicker was fragile, and soon the shadows returned. Denistone, though charming, was not free from entanglements of his own. His past carried with it complexities, debts, disputes, a history of questionable dealings that soon began to entwine themselves with Almina's already burdened existence. What she had hoped would be a refuge from scandal became instead another theater for it. Lawsuits arose, dragging her name once more into the courts, into the columns of newspapers, into the endless cycle of scrutiny she could never escape. Where she had sought love, she found litigation. Where she had sought companionship, she found complication. It is tempting to ask whether she regretted the marriage, whether she looked back upon her decision with bitterness. But Almina was not a woman easily crushed. She had faced scandal all her life, and this was but another form of it. Perhaps she even saw in it a strange continuation of her destiny, as though scandal itself had become her constant companion, as inevitable as breath. If love was denied her, at least she was not denied the vitality of living, of moving through the world with spirit intact. The newspapers, as ever, relished the spectacle. They painted her as extravagant still, foolish in her choices, reckless with her fortune. Few paused to consider the loneliness that might have driven her toward remarriage, the hunger for tenderness long denied, the simple desire to feel less alone in the vastness of Highclere's shadow. Society rarely affords such mercy. It prefers the sharpness of judgment to the softness of understanding. And so Almina became once again a figure of gossip, her life reduced to headlines and whispered commentary. Yet beyond the scandal, there remained a quieter truth. She continued to endure. She faced each lawsuit with the same composure she had worn since girlhood, her head high, her voice steady. She did not retreat into bitterness or collapse into despair. Instead, she walked forward, carrying the weight of each disappointment as she had always done. If companionship eluded her, resilience did not. One imagines her in these years not as the glittering hostess of Highclere, nor as the tireless nurse of wartime, but as a woman older now, wiser, weathered by loss and disillusionment, yet still standing. Her gowns perhaps less resplendent, her jewels fewer, her fortune diminished, yet her spirit intact. She had been born in shadow, thrust into privilege, bound to a restless husband, tied to discovery and death, and now entwined in the scandals of a second union. Through it all, she had not yielded her dignity. That, perhaps, was her truest wealth, and the one possession no lawsuit could claim. At night, when the day's burdens pressed most heavily, she may have sat by a lamp in some quieter house, for Highclere was no longer always her home. The flame flickered, casting long shadows across the room, and in its trembling light she must have reflected on the strange course of her life. Had she ever truly known love? Or had her life been one long series of bargains, first as daughter of Alfred de Rothschild, then as wife of George Herbert, then as widow, then as wife once more? Did she regret the choices, or did she accept them as the shape carved for her by destiny? The silence that followed such thoughts must have been profound, and into that silence crept the faintest of sounds, the cry of a bird once more, though this time not a gull nor an owl, but the gentle coo of a dove, carried on the night air. Its voice was softer, more tender, as though the world itself sought to remind her that love, though elusive, still existed somewhere beyond her reach. She listened, perhaps with a faint smile, perhaps with tears, and wondered whether it had ever truly been meant for her, or whether companionship, like wealth, was always a gift borrowed, never owned. The dove's call faded, leaving her once again with silence. Yet in that silence lay not only loneliness but also the echo of resilience, the quiet strength that had carried her through every scandal, every disappointment, every burden. She was still standing, still enduring, still herself. And though the world might reduce her to whispers, she knew the truth of her own endurance, and that truth could never be taken from her. The coo of the dove faded into the night, its gentle murmur swallowed by silence, and for a moment Almina might have believed that tenderness, however fleeting, had brushed the edge of her life. Yet silence, as it so often did, carried with it not comfort, but unease, and soon the quiet was broken, not by birdsong, but by the voices of men in courtrooms, voices raised in accusation and defense. For Colonel Ian Onslow Dennis-Toone, the man she had chosen as her second chance at companionship, became entangled in a scandal that drew Almina once more into the harsh glare of public judgment. The trial was not merely about money or fraud, it was about reputation, and reputation had always been Almina's most fragile possession. From the moment of her birth, her identity had been whispered about, her parentage questioned, her place contested. She had built her life upon a foundation of appearances, maintained with wealth and dignity, and now that foundation was once again shaken. Dennis-Toone was accused of deceit, of dishonorable dealings, of actions that brought into question not only his own character, but the character of those bound to him. As his wife, Almina could not remain untouched. Her name appeared in newspapers, her presence discussed in court, her dignity weighed against scandal. One can imagine her entering the courtroom, the air thick with the scent of ink and dust, the benches filled with curious onlookers, the reporters poised with pens ready to record every gesture. She, who had once presided over glittering salons and grand dinners, now sat beneath the gaze of strangers, her life reduced to testimony, her reputation balanced on scales held by others. She carried herself with the same composure she had always worn, her head high, her voice measured. Yet within, she must have felt the sting of humiliation, the ache of seeing her name dragged through mud once more. The newspapers relished it. For them, Almina was not a woman enduring private sorrow, but a spectacle, a figure whose misfortunes were to be consumed by readers, hungry for gossip. They wrote of her past, of her Rothschild inheritance, of her first husband's death and the supposed curse that had claimed him. They tied her history to her present, weaving a narrative of scandal that seemed to follow her like a shadow. To them, she was not an individual of flesh and feeling, but a symbol of fallen grandeur, a countess now trapped in disgrace. And yet, even in the midst of trial, Almina remained defiant. She spoke with clarity, defended her role, denied wrongdoing. Her voice, though perhaps tinged with fatigue, carried the authority of a woman who had endured too many whispers to be broken by yet another. Those who had expected her collapse found instead her resilience, her refusal to surrender dignity even as the world sought to strip it away. She was, as ever, both wounded and unyielding. But what of love? What of the fragile hope that had drawn her to Denistune in the first place? Did she, as she sat through the proceedings, feel betrayed? Did she look at him and see not the man who had offered companionship, but the man who had brought her into deeper scandal? Or did she accept it with the weary recognition that this, too, was her destiny? To be bound always to men whose choices would cost her peace? The silence of history leaves these questions unanswered, but in their very uncertainty lies the truth of her life. It was always lived in the tension between hope and disappointment. The trial dragged on, its outcome less important than its spectacle. In the end, as with so many scandals, the details faded, but the stain remained. Almina's name once more was associated with disgrace, and yet, as always, she endured. She returned to her life, diminished in fortune, diminished in reputation, yet still standing. She had faced whispers since childhood, faced judgment as a bride, faced loneliness as a wife, faced debts as a widow, and now faced scandal as a second wife. Through it all, she remained unbroken, her spirit scarred but intact. One imagines her, after the trial, retreating not to a glittering salon but to a quiet room, the curtains drawn against the world. She sits by a window, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze distant. Outside, the world continues. Carriages clatter, voices rise, the seasons turn, but within, there is only the slow rhythm of thought. She thinks of her father, Alfred de Rothschild, whose fortune had set her upon this path, and wonders whether he had ever imagined that his gift would lead not to security, but to unending scandal. She thinks of Highclere, of halls once filled with music and laughter, now heavy with memory. She thinks of the Earl, dead in Cairo, his name immortal while hers fades. She thinks of Denistune, whose charm had brought her brief comfort and whose disgrace had brought her renewed humiliation. And in these thoughts, she must have asked herself, was love ever truly meant for her? Or was scandal her only constant companion? The light outside fades, the sky darkening into evening. She rises, drawing the curtains fully, shutting out the world. The room is dim, the lamp flickers, shadows stretch across the walls. In the quiet, she hears again not the coo of the dove, but the harsher cry of the gull, carried inland by unseen winds, its voice sharp, unsettling, a reminder that peace is fragile and fleeting. She closes her eyes, listening, and in that cry hears the echo of her own life, restless, judged, unquiet. When the cry fades, silence returns, heavy and complete. And in that silence, Almina remains, as she always has, poised, enduring, unbroken, yet forever pursued by scandal, as though it were the shadow she could never escape. The silence that returned after the gull's cry was not the silence of calm, but of depletion, as if the air itself had grown thin, as if the world were holding back a breath it no longer wished to spend. In that silence, Almina began to feel the full measure of loss, not the sudden loss of death or scandal, but the slower, more relentless loss that erodes like water upon stone, the vanishing of fortune. For years she had lived within the illusion of endless abundance, her Rothschild inheritance vast enough to rescue castles, finance expeditions, and dazzle society. Yet now, in the shadow of lawsuits and creditors, that illusion crumbled. Wealth, once her shield, had become her burden, and now it slipped away piece by piece, leaving behind only the ache of absence. The decline did not arrive all at once. It crept slowly, almost imperceptibly until its weight could no longer be denied. Creditors pressed with greater urgency, their patience worn thin by decades of indulgence. Lawsuits multiplied, each demanding payment, each gnawing at the remnants of her reserves. The houses that had once echoed with laughter grew quieter, their maintenance neglected, their grandeur tarnished. Servants, once countless, dwindled in number. The halls that had required an army of attendants now stood half empty, shadows stretching longer where once there had been life. Almina had lived much of her life in performance, wearing her fortune like armor, her jewels like a crown. To admit decline was unthinkable, yet even she could not hide the truth forever. Her gowns remained elegant but fewer, her entertainments continued but smaller. Those who once courted her favor drifted away, for society is quick to scatter when the scent of ruin lingers in the air. She had been admired for her wealth as much as her charm, and without the former, the latter seemed less urgent to those who gathered in glittering rooms. Loneliness pressed more tightly, its grip stronger than scandal, for scandal at least brought attention, but decline brought abandonment. The Rothschild inheritance, so lavish at the beginning, seemed almost cursed in its ending. It had saved Highclere, yet left her drained. It had financed discovery, yet brought her only widowhood and whispers of curses. It had bought her entry into society, yet ensured she was never free of suspicion. And now, as it vanished, it revealed how fragile her life had always been. Built not upon belonging but upon coin, upon a gift she could never entirely claim as her own. Was it truly inheritance, or was it merely loan, destined always to be reclaimed by time? One imagines her sitting at a desk surrounded by letters, the ink demands of creditors spread before her, each one another nail driven into the coffin of her fortune. Her hand, once used to signing checks with ease, now trembled with reluctance. She signed still, but each signature carried the weight of finality, the knowledge that fewer reserves remained. In the quiet of the room, the scratching of her pen must have sounded like the scraping of erosion itself, the slow wearing away of her security. And yet she endured. Even as her fortune dwindled, she carried herself with dignity. She faced the courts, answered the charges, bore the humiliation. She did not collapse into despair. She did not retreat into bitterness. Pride remained her final possession, and she guarded it fiercely. Perhaps it was all she had left to hold, but it was also the truest expression of her spirit. For wealth may vanish, but dignity, if preserved, can outlast even ruin. The halls of Highclere, however, were no longer hers as they once had been. The castle, which she had saved with her dowry, which she had filled with wounded soldiers during the war, which had echoed with her laughter and her loneliness, slipped from her grasp. Her son, now the 6th Earl, carried it forward, and she became an outsider to the very home she had preserved. To walk away from those gates must have felt like walking away from herself, leaving behind a part of her life that could never be reclaimed. The silence of the fields, once filled with crows and owls and gulls, now seemed to echo only with absence. There is a peculiar sorrow in watching wealth dissolve. Poverty can be endured if it is familiar, but decline is a wound that cuts deeper, for it carries with it the memory of abundance. To have known the security of endless reserves and then to face the demands of creditors is to feel not only loss but betrayal, as though life itself has turned cruel. Almina, once courted for her fortune, now found herself pursued for its remnants. The suitors who had sought her hand, the society that had welcomed her glitter, the world that had taken from her without end, none returned to ease her burden. She was left to bear it alone. And yet perhaps, within this decline, there was also a strange clarity. Freed from the illusions of abundance, she may have seen the truth of her life more plainly, that wealth had never granted her belonging, that jewels had never brought her love, that castles had never given her peace. What remained was herself, her endurance, her ability to carry on despite every shadow. If wealth was gone, if fortune had slipped through her hands, still she remained. One evening, as she walked through the remnants of a garden once filled with flowers, she paused beside a fountain long since dry. Its stone basin was cracked, its water gone, its sound silenced. She looked upon it, and perhaps she saw in it a mirror of her own life, once overflowing, now empty, yet still standing. The fountain remained, though its song was silenced. So too did she remain, though her fortune was gone. As twilight deepened, a wind stirred through the garden, rustling the branches of trees grown untended. The sound was neither the sharp cry of gulls nor the haunting call of owls, but the softer sigh of leaves, whispering of change, of endings, of the slow turning of time. She listened, and in that whisper heard the truth. Wealth vanishes, castles fade, reputations crumble, but endurance remains. And in that moment, though fortune had deserted her, Almina remained herself, scarred, diminished but unbroken, listening to the vanishing echoes of wealth and finding within the silence the faintest trace of strength. The sigh of leaves lingered in the twilight, a sound softer than breath, carrying with it the truth of change that no hand could halt. In that whisper lay the reminder that nothing endures unchanged, not fortunes, not marriages, not even castles of stone. And so it was that Highclere, the house into which Almina had poured her dowry, her energy, her very identity, continued without her. The castle remained as it always had, its towers piercing the sky, its lawns stretching outward like a green sea, but within those walls she was no longer mistress. It stood now not as her domain but as memory, a monument both to her triumph and to her absence. Few images capture impermanence so clearly as the sight of a house once filled with one's presence, now belonging to others. Almina had saved Highclere when it teetered upon ruin. Her father's fortune had restored its grandeur, had allowed its doors to remain open, its fires to keep burning. She had transformed its halls into a hospital, its bedrooms into wards, its silence into healing. She had filled it with flowers and laughter, had entertained dignitaries and soldiers alike, had walked its corridors as both prisoner and queen. And now she walked away, leaving it in the hands of her son, the 6th Earl, a house both preserved by her and denied to her. It is not difficult to imagine her standing one last time upon the great terrace, gazing across the Hampshire fields, the wind stirring her veil, the air cool with evening. Before her stretched the castle she had carried upon her shoulders for decades, the castle whose very survival was bound to her name, yet whose ownership was bound to others. Did she feel bitterness or only resignation? Did she weep, or did she carry herself away with the same composure she had always shown? The silence of history gives no certain answer, but in that moment she must have felt the strange truth that what one preserves does not always preserve one in return. For Highclere was more than stone, it was symbol. To the world it represented continuity, grandeur, the unbroken line of aristocracy. To Almina, it was a reminder of impermanence, of sacrifice unacknowledged, of the fragility of belonging. The house stood eternal, yet her place within it had always been fragile, borrowed, conditional. Now, separated from its walls, she carried only memory, the sound of footsteps upon its floors, the sight of portraits staring down with silent judgment, the echo of laughter that had once filled its chambers. The loss of Highclere was not the loss of shelter alone, it was the loss of identity. For decades she had been Lady Carnarvon of Highclere, her very title intertwined with its towers. To be parted from it was to be parted from a piece of herself. Yet perhaps in that parting there was also a kind of freedom, however cold. For no longer was she bound to maintain appearances within its walls, no longer tethered to the endless demands of hosting, of preserving, of sustaining. The castle remained, but she was free to move beyond it, though freedom at such a cost is often indistinguishable from exile. In her later years, she lived in smaller houses, places without the grandeur of Highclere, without the weight of its lineage. These new dwellings were not filled with the same obligations. They were humbler, quieter, more private. Yet in their simplicity they must have felt foreign, for she had lived so long surrounded by scale and spectacle. To walk a modest corridor after decades in galleries that stretched like cathedrals must have been to feel the shrinking of her own life. Still, perhaps there was comfort in the smaller spaces, a kind of intimacy the great house had never given her. In rooms without portraits, she was freed from ancestral stairs. In gardens without terraces, she was freed from memories of farewells. Highclere, however, did not release her entirely. It lingered always in her memory, its image carved into her life as deeply as any wound. She must have read of it still, heard of it still, known that it continued in grandeur, its fires lit, its guests entertained, its history expanding without her. Each mention must have been both comfort and sting, a reminder that she had saved it and lost it, that she belonged to it yet no longer lived within its walls. And yet perhaps she also knew that Highclere itself was impermanent, no matter its stone. Houses endure centuries, but they too fade. Their wealth crumbles. Their names pass into obscurity. The permanence of stone is an illusion, just as the permanence of wealth is illusion. In this, Highclere was mirror of her own life, grand, admired, sustained at immense cost, and yet vulnerable, fragile, always dependent upon forces beyond itself. To be separated from it was to be reminded that nothing endures, not houses, not fortunes, not even names. One imagines her returning once, perhaps only in memory, walking again the long gallery, hearing her own footsteps echo against stone, feeling the weight of portraits above. She pauses by the great window, looking out across the lawns, and for a moment the castle is hers again, not in possession but in recollection. She closes her eyes and the silence is filled with the voices of the past, the laughter of guests, the groans of wounded soldiers, the restless pacing of her husband, the distant cries of crows in the fields. When she opens her eyes, the gallery is empty, the portrait still, the silence unbroken. Highclere remains, but she is gone from it. As twilight settles, the sigh of leaves from the garden grows louder, carried through open windows. It is a softer sound than the cries of crows, owls, or gulls, a sound not of warning or omen, but of surrender, of time moving gently yet irresistibly. She listens, and in that sigh she hears both the fading of her fortune and the fading of her claim to Highclere. The house continues without her, just as life itself continues without recognition of sacrifice. And so she turns from memory, leaving the castle to its history, and steps into the quieter years of her own life, years marked less by grandeur than by endurance, less by belonging than by separation. Highclere without her was still Highclere. Almina without Highclere was something else entirely, though perhaps only she ever truly knew what that meant. The sigh of leaves drifted through the air like the fading breath of a season, and in that sound was the truth of decline, of lives retreating from grandeur into shadows. So it was with Almina, who, once mistress of Highclere, found herself now walking into years that carried little of the splendor she had known, years marked not by triumph or scandal, but by quiet retreat, by illness, by the slow dimming of a presence once so vividly displayed. Where once her life had been lived upon a stage, lit by chandeliers and watched by countless eyes, now she stepped into obscurity, her figure less visible, her voice less heard, her name spoken only in passing, often with the faint note of pity. It is a strange thing to fade from the stage after so long upon it. Almina had lived her youth under the weight of whispers, her marriage under the glare of expectation, her widowhood beneath the shadow of scandal. She had endured judgment, gossip, admiration, envy, and disdain, but she had never been unseen. Now, however, the world turned its gaze elsewhere. The story of Tutankhamun continued without her. The castle of Highclere thrived without her. Society, restless and forgetful, moved on to new scandals, new figures, new spectacles. She remained, but she was no longer central, no longer indispensable. Illness, too, pressed against her in these later years. The strength that had carried her through war, through trials, through widowhood, began to falter. Her body, once adorned with silks and jewels, now carried the weight of age, the frailty that time bestows without mercy. Pain became a companion, fatigue a constant shadow. Yet even as her health declined, she bore it with the same composure that had marked her life. She did not collapse into despair. She endured, as she always had, with dignity intact. Her surroundings grew smaller, humbler. No longer the vast galleries and sweeping staircases of Highclere, but modest rooms where she passed her days, attended by fewer servants, visited by fewer friends. In such spaces, memories loom larger, for without distraction, the past rises to fill the quiet. One can imagine her sitting by a window in some quiet house, the light falling across her face, her gaze distant as memories drifted like ghosts. The wedding that bound her to Highclere, the soldiers she nursed in its halls, the letters from Egypt, the trial of scandal, the sound of gulls, owls and doves echoing across her years. Each memory carried both pride and sorrow, both triumph and loss, woven together into the fabric of a life not easily forgotten, even if the world chose to forget it. Loneliness must have deepened in these years, for the companions who had once filled her life had either departed or grown distant. Her first husband lay buried, immortalized by discovery and death. Her second embroiled her in scandal and faded from significance. Her father, whose fortune had shaped her destiny, was long gone. Children and descendants carried their own burdens, their own entanglements, their own lives, but her own circle shrank. The silence of her rooms was not filled by laughter or by the murmur of society's attention. It was filled only by the steady ticking of clocks, the faint rustle of leaves outside, the sigh of time itself. And yet even in solitude, she was not entirely erased. Those who remembered her spoke still of her energy, her wit, her generosity, her tireless work during the war. Soldiers who had lain in beds at Highclere spoke of her kindness. Friends recalled her laughter, her presence in drawing rooms. She may have been fading from society's stage, but she remained in the memories of those she had touched, however fleetingly. Perhaps this was her truest legacy, not the wealth that had dissolved, nor the scandals that had pursued her, but the simple remembrance of humanity, of moments where she had eased pain, where she had brought light into shadow. Still, the fading was inevitable. The newspapers, once filled with her name, rarely mentioned her now. The scandals that had once seemed to define her grew old, unworthy of print. Younger figures emerged, new stories captured attention, and Almina's life slipped further into obscurity. She became, in a sense, her own ghost, alive yet unseen, moving through rooms where memory was her only company. One evening, as the autumn light dwindled, she sat alone by a lamp, its glow soft against the encroaching dark. Outside, the leaves whispered in the wind, their sigh a continuation of the sound she had heard so often before. She listened, and in their murmur she heard the story of her own fading, once bright, now dim, once abundant, now scarce, once central, now peripheral. She did not weep, she simply listened, her face calm, her eyes distant, her spirit steady. The stage had receded, the audience departed, the lights dimmed, yet she remained, not as performer but as witness, watching her own life retreat into silence. There is dignity even in fading, if one accepts it, if one carries it with grace. And Almina, who had endured so much, carried her fading with the same resilience that had marked all her days. The lamp flickered, the leaves sighed, and in that moment the world seemed suspended, holding her not in grandeur, but in quiet truth. The lamp flickered, its flame bending with the faint sigh of leaves beyond the window. And in that wavering light, Almina might have seen not only the dimming of her own years, but also the shapes of those who came after her. For no life, however solitary, ends within itself. Children and descendants carry fragments of the past forward, sometimes as treasure, sometimes as burden, often as both. And in the story of Almina Carnarvon, the legacy passed to her children was as complex as her own life, gilded by fortune, shadowed by scandal, and shaped by choices they had never made but could never escape. Her son, Henry, inherited the title upon the death of his father, becoming the 6th Earl of Carnarvon. Highclere, the castle she had preserved with her dowry, became his domain, not hers. To him fell the responsibility of continuing the line, of carrying the name forward into a century that no longer revered aristocracy as once it had. For the world was changing, and the old certainties of privilege were eroding just as quickly as her own fortune had. Henry grew up in the midst of wealth and whisper, and though he carried the title with dignity, the legacy he bore was far from simple. He inherited not only the grandeur of Highclere, but also the shadow of a father's restless spirit and a mother's whispered origins. It is difficult to say how much of Almina lingered in him. The energy, the pride, the resilience. Children often carry unspoken echoes of their parents, not in gestures alone, but in the silent burdens they inherit. Henry must have known that his home stood because of his mother's fortune, that the treasures of Tutankhamun were uncovered because of her wealth, even if her name was rarely spoken in gratitude. He lived in a castle that bore her sacrifice, yet history would remember it as his father's seat. Did he ever acknowledge, in quiet reflection, that without her none of it would have survived? Or did he, like society itself, prefer to let her role remain in shadow? The answer is hidden, but the question remains. Her daughter, Evelyn, carried a different legacy. For daughters, inheritance is less of stone and title, more of reputation and memory. Evelyn moved in society, married, lived a life less documented than her brother's, but she too bore the echo of Almina's story. To be the child of a woman whispered about is to be whispered about in turn, no matter how distant. The Rothschild blood, the scandal of illegitimacy, the extravagance, the resilience. These threads wove themselves into Evelyn's identity, whether she claimed them or not. A daughter inherits not only features and mannerisms, but also the invisible aura of her mother's reputation, and Evelyn's life must have been touched by that inheritance in ways impossible to measure. And beyond them, grandchildren and further descendants carried fragments still more diluted, like echoes fading down a long corridor. Yet even faint echoes shaped the air. To walk through Highclere in later generations was to walk in the shadow of Almina, even if her name was not spoken. The castle bore her imprint. The family bore her mark. Her sacrifices, her fortune, her scandals, all lingered, shaping the future in ways unseen but undeniable. Legacy is never simple. It is not only wealth passed on, nor titles sustained, but the intangible weight of stories, of choices, of whispers that cling to a name. Almina's children and their children lived under that weight, inheriting not only a castle and a title, but also the contradictions of her life, the grandeur and the decline, the generosity and the scandal, the strength and the sorrow. To carry her legacy was to carry ambiguity itself, to live in the tension between admiration and judgment. One imagines Almina in her quieter later years, watching her children from a distance, seeing in them both pride and anxiety. Did she feel comfort, knowing that the name continued, the line endured, Highclere remained in their hands? Or did she feel unease, seeing them carry the burdens she herself had borne, watching them struggle with debts, with reputation, with the same expectations that had caged her? Perhaps she felt both, for motherhood is rarely simple, and legacy is never clear. At times, she may have longed to tell them the truth, that wealth is fleeting, that belonging cannot be bought, that reputation is a wind that shifts without warning. Perhaps she wanted to warn them that to rely upon fortune is to build upon sand, that to seek approval in society is to chase shadows. Yet such truths are rarely spoken, even between mothers and children. More often they are left unspoken, carried in glances, in silences, in the weight of memory. And so her children live their own lives, carrying her legacy without her counsel, bearing her presence without her words. In this way, Almina's story did not end with her. It rippled outward, carried in the lives of her descendants, woven into the fabric of Highclere itself. To this day, those who walk its corridors walk also in her shadow, even if they do not know it. For the castle stands because of her, the lineage endures because of her, the name remains because of her. And though history may forget her, the stone remembers, the walls remember, the silence remembers. One evening, as she sat alone, the lamp flickering low, she may have thought of this. The leaves whispered outside, the air cool, the silence deep. She thought of Henry, of Evelyn, of the children who would follow them, of the lives that would unfold long after hers was gone. And in that thought, she must have felt both comfort and sorrow. Comfort that she would not be entirely erased, sorrow that she would not be remembered as she truly was. Legacy is never truth. It is always distortion, always partial, always shadow. She knew this, and in knowing it, she surrendered to the sigh of leaves, allowing the wind to carry her story onward, however altered, however incomplete. The lamp flickered again, the flame bending low, and in its tremor she saw not her own face but the faint outline of future generations, carrying her forward, whether they wished it or not. The lamp flickered, its small flame bending as though uncertain, wavering between light and shadow. In that tremor lay the question that had lingered across all of Almina's years, a question never answered by society, never settled by scandal, never resolved even within herself. Had she ever truly known love? For what is a life adorned with jewels, with castles, with riches and recognition, if love is absent? The flickering flame seemed to ask this question with each shiver of its light, and in the silence of her later years, she may have asked it too. Her first marriage, though splendid in ceremony and rich in consequence, had been a bargain more than a union. George Herbert, the 5th Earl of Carnarvon, had needed her fortune as desperately as she had needed his title. Their wedding had been attended by admiration and envy, yet beneath the gilded surface lay the truth. She was his salvation, not his beloved. He had pursued his passions, horses, gambling, motor cars, Egypt, while she financed, supported, endured. Their companionship was marked not by intimacy, but by necessity. Their partnership more a contract than a covenant. Did she love him? Perhaps in some fleeting way, the way a young bride might love the idea of belonging, the thrill of grandeur, the promise of significance. But as years unfolded, what tenderness existed was worn away by distance, by debts, by restlessness. She nursed soldiers with tenderness, but her husband she did not nurse. She gave to him wealth, but he gave to her little companionship in return. Her second marriage to Colonel Ian Onslow Dennistoun seemed at first to offer a chance at something different, something warmer. He was not of the aristocratic mold, not tethered to castles or ancient lineage. His charm, his presence, his attention must have seemed like a balm to a woman who had lived so long in absence. Perhaps she thought, "Here at last is the partner who will see me not for my fortune but for myself." Yet hope proved fragile. The marriage brought not peace but turmoil, not intimacy but scandal. The trial that followed him drew her into humiliation once again, and whatever companionship she had sought was overshadowed by disgrace. Did she love him? Perhaps she loved the idea of being loved, of being chosen for reasons beyond utility. But the reality, as always, was harsher. And so the lamp flickered on, and the question remained, was love ever truly hers? Or was it always an illusion, glimpsed but never grasped? To those who observed her life from outside, she was a woman of fortune, of glamour, of scandal. They measured her in jewels and debts, in lawsuits and headlines, but within her own silence, she may have measured herself differently, not in riches, but in tenderness, in companionship, in affection that she had given yet seldom received. Perhaps she found love not in husbands, but in moments, in the grateful smile of a wounded soldier at Highclere, in the touch of a hand she held while death passed near, in the laughter of her children before the weight of inheritance fell upon them. Perhaps love for her was not a grand romance, but small fragments scattered through years of endurance, fragments often overlooked yet deeply felt. Love may not have been her story in the way the world defines it, but perhaps it was present in these quieter forms, forms the world never recorded. Still, one cannot help but wonder whether she longed for more. To stand in great halls adorned with chandeliers, to wear gowns shimmering with jewels, to be mistress of a castle and patron of discovery, and yet to feel unseen, uncherished. What ache must that have left in her heart? She endured scandal, she endured loss, she endured ruin. But did she also endure the absence of love? If so, was that absence her greatest tragedy, greater even than the vanishing of her fortune? One evening, as the lamp flickered low and the wind sighed through the leaves, she may have thought of this. Her eyes, tired yet steady, looked not at the room around her, but at the memory of her life. She saw her younger self, radiant in a wedding gown, stepping into Highclere with pride and trepidation. She saw herself walking through wards filled with soldiers, her hands busy, her heart stirred by their gratitude. She saw herself standing on terraces, reading letters from Egypt, hearing news of discovery and death. She saw herself in courtrooms, her name spoken by strangers, her dignity tested. And through all these visions she searched for love, for a moment when she had truly been seen, truly been cherished. The flame trembled, and perhaps in that tremor she realized that love, if it had visited her, had done so in fleeting shadows. It had not anchored her life, as wealth had, or as scandal had. It had passed across her like birdsong carried by wind, beautiful, haunting, but never lasting. Was this failure, or was it simply the truth of her fate? Perhaps love was not denied her. Perhaps it was only given in forms she did not expect, forms too subtle to satisfy but too real to ignore. The flame bent once more, its glow soft against the gathering dark. She leaned closer, listening not with her ears but with her memory. And in that fragile silence, perhaps she heard again the coo of the dove, the cry of the gull, the call of the owl, the caw of the crow, all voices that had marked her years, all symbols of longing, of warning, of tenderness, of loss. Each bird had sung of a different truth, and together their cries wove a chorus that seemed to echo the question of her life. When the lamp flickered for the last time that night, she did not answer the question. Love remained uncertain, ambiguous, half present, half absent, like the flame itself, wavering between light and shadow. The lamp flickered, wavered, and then steadied, its light trembling as though stirred by a breath from far away. In its glow, Almina might have seen not only the questions of her heart, but also the shadow of the tomb, that chamber of gold and silence buried deep within the Valley of the Kings. Though years had passed since the day her husband first peered into the darkness and heard Carter's words of wonderful things, the tomb's shadow lingered still, stretching across her life as surely as it stretched across the world's imagination. For Tutankhamun's name, long forgotten by history, had been reborn, and with it, the name of Carnarvon. And though she had never set foot upon the sands of Egypt, never stooped beneath the lintel of the tomb, Almina was bound to it all the same. The world could not let go of the story of the curse. Each year brought fresh retellings, fresh embellishments, fresh whispers that seemed to grow with time rather than fade. The Earl's sudden death in Cairo became legend, woven into tales of vengeance from beyond the grave. Newspapers and novels alike fed upon it, transforming history into myth. Lights flickering out, dogs howling, clocks stopping, mysterious illnesses. All were gathered into the fabric of the tale. Some laughed at it, others feared it, but all repeated it, until the curse became as real as the gold it guarded. And in every telling there was Almina. Though faintly, as the widow left behind, the woman tied to scandal and sorrow, the one who had given her fortune to finance the discovery. She must have read these stories, seen her name bound again and again to Egypt, and felt the irony, for she had never chosen this path. It had been chosen for her by a restless husband and the demands of fortune. Yet now she was forever tied to it, remembered not for her own deeds, but for the discovery that had cost her husband his life and left her a widow. It was as though the tomb itself had claimed her, binding her to its story in a shadow she could never escape. And yet, within that shadow there was also a strange kind of immortality. History forgets many names, but Tutankhamun's discovery was too vast, too dazzling to be forgotten. And so the Earl's name endured, and with it, in quieter tones, hers. Not as the heroine, not as the discoverer, not even as the widow spoken of with reverence, but as a footnote, an echo, a presence half hidden. Still, even an echo can endure, and in this way Almina found herself tied to eternity, not by choice but by consequence. What must she have felt in her later years as she looked back upon it all? Did she resent the tomb for stealing her husband, for leaving her alone, for binding her to superstition and scandal? Or did she see in it a grim justice, that the man who had consumed her fortune in endless pursuits had found both his triumph and his doom in one final venture? Perhaps she felt both, for the tomb was both glory and grave, both treasure and curse, both immortality and death. The treasures themselves, glittering in Cairo and later in London, must have seemed unreal to her, seen only in photographs, described only in reports. Gold masks, amulets, thrones, jewels that had lain in darkness for millennia, all revealed to the eyes of a world starved for wonder. And she, who had provided the means, who had paid the price, saw them only from a distance. Did she marvel at them? Or did she turn her eyes away, unable to bear the thought of what they had cost her? In their brilliance, perhaps she saw not wonder, but loss, not beauty, but absence. The curse, though dismissed by scholars, lingered in the public mind, and its whispers must have pursued her in every drawing room she entered. To some, she was the widow of the man who had defied the pharaoh and died. To others, she was the woman cursed by wealth, cursed by scandal, cursed by fate. Did she laugh at these whispers, or did she hear in them an echo of truth? For her life had indeed been shadowed, not by ancient priests, but by the unrelenting demands of fortune, reputation, and survival. The curse, if it existed, was not in the tomb alone, but in the burdens she had carried all her life. Still, there is something haunting in the thought that Almina's name will never be spoken without Egypt hovering nearby, without the tomb's shadow stretching across it. She had been born into whispers, lived in scandal, endured widowhood and decline, yet in the end it was Egypt that claimed her story, Egypt that tied her name to eternity. History does not remember her for Highclere's hospital, nor for her generosity, nor for her resilience. It remembers her faintly as the widow of the earl who financed the discovery of Tutankhamun. Such is the cruelty of legacy, that what is remembered is not what one chooses, but what the world decides. One evening, as the lamp flickered again and the leaves whispered against the window, she may have thought of this. She may have closed her eyes and seen not the quiet English countryside, but the golden sands of the Nile, the heat shimmering, the tomb's doorway gaping open, the treasures within gleaming like a dream. She may have heard the desert wind, carrying whispers of priests long dead, of kings long buried, of curses long spoken, and in that vision she may have seen herself, not in gold, not in glory, but in shadow, forever bound, forever forgotten, forever present. The lamp trembled, the flame bending low, and for a moment the room seemed filled not with twilight, but with desert dust, the silence of Highclere mingling with the silence of the tomb, two silences meeting, two worlds colliding, England and Egypt, fortune and loss, love and absence, glory and decline, and in that silence the shadow of the tomb remained, eternal. The desert dust lingered in the mind, mingling with the silence of Highclere, two worlds colliding across distance and time, and just as the sand drifts over ruins until only faint outlines remain, so too did Almina's life in its final years become covered by layers of obscurity, her presence fading, her story softened into whispers, her figure retreating into quiet. The widow who had once filled castle halls with laughter, who had nursed soldiers through war, who had financed discovery and endured scandal, now moved through the closing chapters of her life, with little notice from the world that had once pursued her every gesture. The decades after Egypt stretched long. The treasures of Tutankhamun dazzled the world, displayed in museums, celebrated in books, their golden brilliance defying time. But Almina, bound to their discovery yet excluded from their glory, drifted into anonymity. Her fortune, once so vast, had been consumed. Her scandals, once so public, grew stale and forgotten. The society that had judged her moved on to fresher tales. She was left in smaller houses, modest rooms, spaces far from the grandeur of Highclere, and farther still from the shimmering sands of the Nile. Age laid its hand upon her. Illness became a constant companion, weakening the body that had once carried her through the long corridors of castles, through hospital wards, through courtrooms and drawing rooms. Pain pressed closer, fatigue deepened, and the resilience that had marked her life was tested once more, not by scandal or loss, but by time itself. To grow old is to endure a different kind of trial, a slow erosion rather than a sudden blow. Almina bore it as she had borne all else, with composure, with dignity, with silence. Visitors were fewer in these years. The friends of her youth had passed, the admirers of her beauty long gone, the guests of her glittering dinners dispersed. Her children carried their own burdens, their own entanglements, their own distance. She remained in many ways alone, her days marked by the quiet rhythm of routine, her nights by the steady ticking of clocks. The silence of her rooms echoed not with laughter or whispers, but with the faint rustle of curtains, the creak of floorboards, the sigh of wind outside. It was not the silence of grandeur, but the silence of absence, of life withdrawing step by step. Yet within that silence, memory remained, and memory, though often cruel, also carried tenderness. She must have thought of her childhood, of her father, Alfred de Rothschild, whose love had been expressed in jewels and fortune, whose presence had shaped her destiny. She must have thought of her youth, her wedding to George Herbert, the castle she entered with pride and unease. She must have thought of her years at Highclere, the hospital she created during the war, the soldiers whose lives she touched. She must have thought of Egypt, of the letters, of the news of discovery and death. She must have thought of her second marriage, its fleeting hope and swift disgrace. She must have thought of her children, their inheritance, their struggles. And she must have thought of herself, the woman who had carried all this, who had endured, who had been indispensable, yet forgotten. Did she feel regret? Perhaps. Did she feel pride? Perhaps also. More likely, she felt both. For lives are never one thing but many, and Almina's life was filled with contradictions that could never be resolved. She was both rich and ruined, celebrated and ignored, central and peripheral, strong and wounded. To reflect upon such a life is not to find a single truth, but to accept the tension of many truths held together. Her death came quietly in 1969. No grand headlines marked it. No great ceremony honored her. She died as she had lived in her final decades, in silence and obscurity, far from the grandeur of Highclere, far from the sands of Egypt, far from the whispers of society that had once pursued her. It was an ending both ordinary and extraordinary, ordinary in its quietness, extraordinary in its irony. For this was a woman who had once stood at the center of so much and yet left the world without spectacle. And yet perhaps there was a certain grace in this quiet end. For after years of scandal, of judgment, of endless attention, perhaps she deserved silence. Silence not of absence, but of rest. Silence not of erasure, but of peace. The world may not have marked her passing, but perhaps in that very neglect lay a kind of release. She was no longer a figure for gossip, no longer a shadow bound to scandal. She was simply herself at last, laid to rest beyond the reach of whispers. Still, the irony lingers. The treasures of Tutankhamun endure, gleaming in glass cases, studied by scholars, admired by millions. Highclere endures, its towers familiar to new generations, its grandeur celebrated in stories and screens. The Earl endures, remembered in tales of discovery and curse. But Almina, who bound it all together, who financed, who endured, who saved, who lost, she faded into near forgetfulness. Her story, if told, is told in fragments, in footnotes, in half-remembered asides. She became, in the end, a silence within history. Her presence felt but not spoken, her truth veiled. One evening in her last year, perhaps, as the lamp flickered low and her body ached with time, she may have heard again the faintest of sounds, the sigh of leaves, the cry of distant birds, the silence of her own breath. She may have closed her eyes and felt herself drift not toward scandal or fortune or legacy, but toward rest, the final silence that holds no judgment, no expectation, no whisper. And in that silence she was free. The final silence that enfolded Almina at the end of her days was not merely the stillness of death, but the silence of history, that vast and patient expanse into which all lives dissolve. And yet, within that silence, her story lingers like the faint echo of footsteps across a stone corridor, never fully gone, never fully present, heard only by those who pause to listen. For Almina's life was not simple. It was a tapestry of contradictions, woven of fortune and scandal, resilience and loneliness, triumph and decline. To reflect upon it is to reflect not upon one woman alone, but upon the fragile dance between wealth and happiness, privilege and belonging, visibility and erasure. She was born in shadow, her very existence whispered about, her parentage both gift and wound. From that beginning she entered the glittering halls of Highclere, where her wealth preserved what lineage alone could not. She gave her dowry, her fortune, her years, binding herself to a man who sought in her not love, but salvation. She filled the role, she wore the crown, she endured the whispers, and in those same halls, when war came, she transformed privilege into purpose, tending the wounded, offering kindness where society saw only duty. For a brief time, she found meaning, not in jewels or titles, but in service. Yet the pattern of her life was always marked by another's hand. The Earl's restlessness carried her fortune to races, to motor cars, to Egypt. She was financier, never companion, presence without recognition. And when his name was tied forever to the tomb of Tutankhamun, hers was tied faintly, a shadow behind the glory, a widow bound not by choice but by consequence. The world remembered him, remembered Carter, remembered the gold. Of her it spoke little. Her second marriage brought not renewal but repetition, another hope, another scandal, another trial. The fortune that had seemed endless dissolved under the weight of demands and debts, and with it dissolved the illusions of permanence. Highclere, which she had saved, continued without her. Her later years, once filled with chandeliers and crowds, narrowed into modest rooms, into quiet, into fading. And yet through all of it, she endured. If she lacked wealth, she retained pride. If she lacked recognition, she retained dignity. So what remains of her now, in the silence across time? Not the gold of Egypt, for it lies in glass cases. Not the towers of Highclere, for they belong to others. Not the jewels, for they have scattered. What remains is the story itself, the quiet recognition that her life reveals the truth of wealth's fragility and society's fickleness. She is emblem of how fortune can buy entry but not belonging, how titles can offer grandeur but not love, how legacy can immortalize names yet erase the very people who made it possible. Perhaps, then, the true measure of her life is not in what was lost, but in what was endured. For endurance is its own form of triumph, quieter than discovery, less dazzling than gold, yet more human, more real. She endured whispers at birth, indifference in marriage, scandal in widowhood, decline in age. She endured neglect, exclusion, judgment. And still she carried herself with grace, her head high, her composure intact. That endurance, though uncelebrated, is the thread that binds her story, the quiet strength that resists erasure even in silence. To reflect upon Almina is also to reflect upon the illusions of wealth. The Rothschild fortune gave her everything and took everything. It opened the gates of Highclere, yet bound her to a loveless bargain. It financed discovery, yet left her widowed and burdened. It sustained grandeur, yet dissolved into lawsuits and debts. Wealth promised security, yet brought only obligation. In her life, wealth was not freedom but cage, not shield but leash. And in her decline, she revealed the truth society rarely admits, that wealth is fleeting, and that without love or belonging, it is but glittering dust. And still, there were moments of light. The wounded soldiers who blessed her name, the laughter of her children in their youth, the gardens at twilight, the quiet of trees in wind, the glimpses of tenderness, however fleeting, however overshadowed, were hers to hold. And perhaps in her final silence, she carried those moments with her, treasures more enduring than gold, more meaningful than castles, more lasting than scandal. Now, when we speak her name, we speak it rarely. She is remembered faintly, as widow of the Earl, as patron of the tomb, as shadow in a grander tale. Yet if we pause, if we listen to the silence, we hear more. We hear the sound of crows above the fields of Highclere, restless and warning. We hear the cries of owls, the coo of doves, the sharp call of gulls carried inland by strange winds. We hear the sigh of leaves at twilight, the flicker of lamps in darkened rooms, the soft murmur of soldiers in hospital beds. These sounds weave her story, subtle but enduring, a chorus of memory carried across time. And beyond them, we hear the desert wind moving endlessly across the sands of Egypt, whispering through the valley of the kings. It carries with it the dust of millennia, the silence of tombs, the brilliance of treasures hidden and revealed. It carries with it the name of Carnarvon, bound forever to Tutankhamun. And though Almina is but shadow in that story, still she is there, for without her the tomb would have remained sealed, the gold unseen, the history unawakened. Her shadow is carved into that discovery as surely as the hieroglyphs upon its walls. The candle burns low, the hall darkens, the wind sighs, the desert whispers. And in that mingling of sounds, we remember her, not in glory, not in scandal, but in the fragile, enduring truth of a life lived between shadow and light.